what turned out to be military history. I just found that military history was more interesting to me, not because I'm interested in military things entirely, but because if you have a country, say like Britain, goes up to 1914, and the Britain of 1914 is not incredibly different to the 1900, but the Britain of 1914 and 1918 is considerably different. So the wars seem to be the stepped up change. I mean, it was a high speed, fast forward change, and I felt that if I studied the wars, the principal wars of the Western world, that I would understand from that the sort of bricks and mortar of history.
Having, kind of lived as children through the Second World War, you were bound to come out with some kind of questions in your mind about why it happened, and I think that he was more engaged by that than most people are, and I think that it probably began from there. He's also the interest in aircraft and the fact that he was in the Air Force doing reconnaissance photography and things like that.
500 German bombers and Messerschmitt fighters roared over the English coast.
I remember once I was in Marylebone Road, and I remember looking up, and there was this formation of German bombers in a box. I remember it because it was sort of like I suppose it was a rectangle, but it was almost a square, and these planes were flying in perfect formation, and there was no anti-aircraft fire or anything going up to them, and it wasn't scary. I mean, it was a spectacle. It was a spectacle that really gripped me.
Successful historians need two things. One is an ability to think themselves into the mindset of the period you're writing about. Len is terrific at doing that. Len understands exactly how people thought and felt in those days. Secondly, it's the quality of analysis, that you wade through all these acres of paper and all these received truths, and you have to have that ability every few hundred pages suddenly say, hang on a minute, this just isn't so.
There was a particular moment when I decided I want to write about Bomber, and that was that I was reading in a magazine about the way in which the German fighters used radar to come up into the bomber stream and see the bombers on the radar. You see, the reason it's very difficult to write a book about the First World War air combat is that everybody is alone in the airplane. They're not talking to each other. So you can't really deal with it as a writer. But in a bomber, you've got 7 guys, and they can talk to each other. So you can have dialogue going all through the action. And the people in the German fighter, there were 2 people in that. They were looking at radar. So you got a chance of linking all this material with the dialogue, and they would be talking to the ground and so on.
Bomb aimers passed alterations to course in the form of 2 lefts or 1 right. The idea being that in the noise and confusion, this would be clearer. In the nose of the aircraft, Digby has his hand on the bomb release switch, his eyes on the flames and lights below. He aims at the center of the burning mass.
Bomb doors open, master switch on, bombs fused and selected.
Steady. Lift. Steady. Up here, Skip. Target's coming up too soon.
It's the right place, looks like an inferno.
Mid up by Skip. Flak getting closer.
Come on, Digby.
Lift.
Just drop the bastard things.
Steady. Steady. Bomb squad.
Bomber featured the attackers and the defenders, in the air and on the ground. Just as his art school teacher had taught him, Deighton had really walked all around a raid before describing it. But after all the courage and horror, the irony was that a tiny twist of fate early on leads to the bombs dropping in the wrong place, an innocuous village, instead of the factories of the Ruhr. As a result, many assumed the book was an anti-war tract.
Where does it say it's an anti-war? I don't say it's an anti-war book. That the publishers have never said it's an anti-war book. This is just exists in your mind as an anti-war book. What this is, it's a war book. This is what war's like. If you like war, go and get into one as soon as you can, because you're going to have the time of your life. So it's not really an anti-war book, it's just a war book.
Bomber is a fantastically accurate ruthless, brutal portrait of what an area bombing raid over Germany was like in 1943. And I reckon to know that field pretty well, and I've written a book about it myself. And I can't fault Len on any detail of that, about what happened over Germany, about the flying, about the planes, about the people. The only thing, if I was going to quibble a bit, I think he overdoes this idea that the toffs were always down on the working class lads, but that's part of Len's act, and it's a very minor fault in what's otherwise a devastatingly brilliant account.
This was a comparatively small raid. If you compare this raid with some of the biggies, you'll realise that though it's all a bit terrifying, it's not really a big raid. But by making it the size I did, I was able to put a finger on the personal tragedies of the people, so that when the people were killed, although there were a lot of them, and that diffuses the drama of it, but still there was enough space for me to make the deaths of the major characters rather saddening.
If the thinly fictionalised bomber had been controversial, when Deighton turned to straight history, the reception was even more hostile.
Now, fighter. It's so easy now, when almost every military historian has recognised a lot of the truths about the Battle of Britain and its limitations, that Len was the first one really to tell us. Len was the first one to drive home the fact that if the Luftwaffe had equipped its fighters with long-range drop tanks, which they easily could have been, that the whole battle could have taken on a different complexion, that we won fantastically narrowly, that the RAF's tactics for a large part of the battle were absolutely terrible, that we were incredibly lucky to get away with it, that the few were very brave, but most of their leaders were not very clever. People who are there, they don't thank you for saying these things, so you need a bit of courage to tell them unwelcome things. And when Len was doing his groundbreaking writing, there were a lot more of them alive to make a fuss, and some of them did.
It wasn't what the Germans said that upset people in England. It was people said in reviews that Len Deighton has no right to write a book about the Battle of Britain and include the views of Germans. I mean, it sounds crazy now, but this was the attitude. I couldn't see it like that. I felt it was much more interesting to, just as I did in Bomber, seeing the two sides of the thing and tackling it in what as honest a way as I knew how to do, I felt was a plus. And I think that was perhaps something that had not been, well, judging by the amount of objection I got, I guess it wasn't a very common way of dealing with the history of the Second World War.
There was more on the war in Blitzkrieg, an account of how the Germans managed to win those early battles so quickly, and in Blood, Tears and Folly, a recent sweeping overview. And all this in-depth knowledge found its way into fiction too. There was Goodbye Mickey Mouse, set among the US Air Force in wartime Britain. And there was Winter, which took the family saga and turned it into a thoughtful consideration of just how the Nazi state emerged from interwar Germany. Indeed, by now, it was Germany as a whole, as much as Berlin, which intrigued him.
It is a fascinating nation. I mean, that the history of Germany is unique to the world, really, in so many different ways. That the way in which Bismarck glued the nation together, usually by invading his neighbours, but the way in which Bismarck envisaged this sort of greater Germany.
I think his interest in Germany and things German comes from an admiration of their military efficiency and ability and a long historical past of military supremacy, and I think that he admires that. I certainly won't subscribe to the fact that he admired the Nazi Party. It wasn't anything to do with the politics, with the idealism of Germans, but I think possibly that aspect of their efficiency mirrored in a way his own very efficient approach to things.
The way in which Bismarck invented the whole welfare system, which was imitated all over the Western world. The whole university system of the Western world is really a German invention. Seminars, these ways in which universities are organised were all invented in Germany. And all of these things I find immensely fascinating. I read about the German election, I follow the German elections, I follow German politics. I really intrigued, not with the idea of writing about it or anything, it's just I can't stop myself. I just find it intriguing.
That delight in knowledge, facts, almost for their own sake, has been with him ever since he used to bunk off school as a small boy and hide in the reference section of the Marylebone Public Library.
I always carry a notebook and a pencil, so I always have a pencil and a notebook, a filofax. And then inside the filofax I have a little digital camera that I can use that will take pictures under pretty bad conditions, so I've got a record. It's a product of an inferiority complex because I didn't go to university, I didn't study English literature, I can't analyse a sentence very successfully. I realised that I was going to have to really be fighting at somebody else's weight when I went into the ring. My interest in researching, in getting hold of research about, say, the Air Force or the Secret Service, was a part of the same sort of thing. Again, it was because I was going to show everybody I was as good as they were, and the way to being good as they were was to work harder than they worked and to get more research than they worked and to talk to more people and to winkle this information out of people.
He got a lot of fun out of research. It wasn't just a dusty library experience for him, although he did do quite a bit of that. Yeah, I think he enjoyed the research as much as the writing, in fact, possibly more, I think. It took him to meet all sorts of interesting people. I know that he's shown you that picture of him with Albert Speer, where he's standing like the Führer. I think it was a wonderful shot. And, of course, he met a whole lot of other people as well. I mean, among them, when he was thinking of doing something on Vietnam.
Met Len Deighton in about 1973 when he came to RAF Bentwaters to do some research. He was going to do some research on a book he was going to write about fighter pilots in Vietnam. And Len shows up in this hairdo, and he looks a lot like John Lennon with his long hair. And so I take him down to the squadron, and Len quickly figures out that, you know, he's not going to be one of the guys with the long hair. He's such a delight to work with. He goes down immediately and gets his hair cut. So we give him a flight suit, and he wears a flight suit around the squadron, and he joins in the squadron duties around the 91st Fighter Squadron at RAF Bentwaters in England. I gave him a ride, and as a matter of fact, I think 2 or 3 rides in the F-4 Phantom. And again, he suited up. He had no concerns whatsoever. He was so curious about the adventure that he never worried about getting sick or any. Therefore, he didn't get sick.
We were flying in close formation, with a very close formation. Then Johnny said, "You've got it." And I thought, we're an automatic pilot. But I wiggled stick a bit and it moved. And I thought, we're not. Jesus Christ, what's this guy doing? Is he crazy? But he sort of actually let me sit in the back seat. I've never been so scared in all my life.
I don't think Len Deighton's going to ever die. But if he did, he would be in a separate line in front of the pearly gates. And I can see him there with the note cards. The pink and the blue and the green note cards with his fountain pen. And going to heaven would be much secondary to having a long conversation with St. Peter at the gates about how he does his business and how they sort this lot from that lot, etc. That would be Len.
The Vietnam War ended before Deighton finished the book, and it remains tantalizingly unpublished. But America and Americans became an increasingly important subject for him.
Somerset Maugham, who wrote about foreigners of various descriptions all through his life, said that there was nothing less valid about writing about foreigners than writing about people that you knew intimately. That it is a valid view. Everyone has a valid view. So I look at the world from what I am, not necessarily where I am, but what I am. So when I wrote Violent Ward about this part of California, I suppose I couldn't shake off that British attitude.
When Len felt he had exhausted the spy world. He took to writing, if you like, crime books, but books with crime in them, but really novels. And, well, the best example of those is a book called Violent Ward. Violent Ward, he says somewhere, is California, the violent ward of the American lunatic asylum. Nice point.
Californians can take a joke. I mean, I've never heard anybody in California say anything about it. So, right on, and yeah, why don't you give it more? I mean, so I think in that way, it's not sort of not alien to the spirit of California.
He came through a wicket gate to pat my jacket with a casual touch to see if I had a gun. I had the feeling he'd done it often. Up close, he smelled of fried onions. It wasn't a very thorough search, and I was grateful. I never did like snorting fried onions on an empty stomach. "So who are you really, Buster?" he said after giving up the search for a gun. "Who do you think I am? The Avon lady?"
He has his hero, who's an American lawyer this time, get involved in various violent situations. And he writes about violence, which is a subject to write about. Should we be violent? How violent should we be? Should we always abhor violence, or does violence sometimes get you somewhere? And this is what makes it a novel.
What unites Violent Ward with the spy stories is the way he tells them, generally through the eyes of his central character.
In creating this character, who is Harry Palmer in the earlier books and Bernard Sampson in his married form in the later books, and it's really a manifestation of my of permanent anger in society. You know, Bernard Sampson doesn't tell the truth. I mean, from a writing point of view, the exercise was that there are 9 books in which 8 of them are written in the first person. But the first person is not telling you the truth. I mean, they're telling you more or less. They're not telling you lies, but they are telling you their version of the truth.
The great thing about writing in the first person, and I unashamedly stole that from Deighton, not many thriller writers write in the first person. It's very